Okay, so welcome everybody. Today we'll be speaking to another one of our authors from Deconstructing Whiteness, Empire and Mission. Today we'll be speaking to Cathy Ross, who co-wrote a chapter with James Butler. So Cathy, could you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Carol. Yeah, as you said, my name's Cathy Ross. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, have lived in Oxford since 2005, and for most of that time have worked and still worked for the Church Mission Society, which is an Anglican mission organisation, and I also am linked to Regent's Park College and Ripon College, Cuddesdon. And although I am a New Zealander, we spent some time with New Zealand CMS, New Zealand Church Mission Society, working in East Africa, mainly in Congo.
Thank you. Could you briefly describe what your chapter's about?
Yeah, so our chapter is about Octavius Hadfield. Octavius was British. He was the CMS missionary to New Zealand from 1839, and he died in 1904. And I became interested and talked James into writing this chapter together because I was very interested in the pamphlets that he wrote. He engaged in a pamphlet war with the Regius Professor of Divinity in Oxford, and also primarily with the Secretary of State for Colonies, the Duke of Newcastle. He wrote a series of pamphlets called One of England's Little Wars, and a sequel to One of England's Little Wars, excoriating the governor of the colony of New Zealand for essentially starting what came to be known as the land wars in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the 19th century. And I became interested in Octavius through his wife, actually, because my PhD, way back in 2004, was on 4 CMS missionary wives to New Zealand in the 19th century. And the fourth woman, I looked at 4 women, and the fourth woman I looked at was Kate Hadfield, Octavius's wife, and actually daughter of a CMS missionary family in Aotearoa, New Zealand at that time. But by reading about Kate, I got to read about Octavius, and I thought he was very interesting because, like all of us, he was a complex character, but certainly from the CMS perspective, he was known as a friend to the Māori, to the Indigenous people. He was fluent in Māori. He was the most educated white person in Aotearoa to know about land issues. He'd made that a study. He understood about land ownership from a Māori perspective. So he was considered a friend of the Māori, but he was also considered by the government to be a traitor because he defended the Māori and was an advocate over Māori land issues. So we just thought he would make an interesting case study as to the complexities of empire. And we nearly called our chapter, we didn't in the end because it's just a bit binary and perhaps a bit cheesy, but to sum up in a way some of his complexities, we nearly called it Pioneering Prophet or Complicit Colonialist, because he was a person of his time, obviously, and I think he has aspects of both sides to his character and his personality, the way he lived and behaved, and some of the language that he used in those pamphlets, which you'll see explored in our chapter. But we felt he was also a mirror to us as we think about and engage in mission today, and as we think about our complicity with the empires of today and what we're involved in and how we're complicit in some of the systems today. So we thought he'd make an interesting case study, and through him we explore land, issues of land, because he was an expert in Māori land ownership. We look at issues of justice, we look at theological anthropology, what did he think about what it meant to be human? We look at the colonial logic of mission, in which he, and to a greater extent us, are embedded in, and then we finished with some of our own learnings from that. So we loved it, we found it fascinating, and James had a steep learning curve in language and Māori language, because so much of the stuff that we read about was in English and quite a bit of Māori thrown in, because the main person that Hadfield was writing about was Wiremu Kingi, a Māori chieftain, and the part that in our chapter, and so Wiremu wrote bits and pieces in Māori that James had to learn quickly.
Thanks. So what made you take this approach to your chapter?
So I think the approach in terms of co-writing was fascinating. So we had lots of conversations. We pored over the material together. We discussed the pamphlets. We discussed the letters by Waramukingi that he wrote, the letters to CMS. So there were letters to the General Secretary of CMS and the board of CMS back in Britain. We looked at some of his sermons. We looked at a very moving letter by 500 chieftains to the Queen. And I guess growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand, I have some insight to that, although obviously I'm white. James had very little insight. So it was interesting hearing his perspective as a British person and an outsider on some of these issues, and bringing his lens of practical theology and his experience and mission to this. So I think we find that when we engage in conversation, it's just very rich, new ideas come up. So we transcribed some of our conversations, well, we recorded them, and then we used free transcription software to go over them, to look at the ideas. And so that's how we developed the chapter. And we just, as I've already said, thought that Octavius Hadfield had a lot to teach us about mission and empire and just some of those complexities. So that's why we co-wrote it together, because of the richness of conversation, the ideas that emerge. And we thought it would be interesting to take on Octavius as a case study, because we could see, as we said, that he was kind of a goodie and a baddie at the same time. And that's what we explore in our chapter. And it's not to necessarily criticize Octavius Hadfield, who was a man of his time and was clearly very loved, actually, by Māori and Pākehā and white New Zealanders. He went on to become the primate of Aotearoa, New Zealand. So it isn't so much to criticize him, but to see what we can learn from him and his context and how that applies to us.
Thank you. What would you say has shaped your social conscience in terms of things like race and inclusivity?
Well, I think growing up in Aotearoa, New Zealand obviously had a huge impact on me. So Aotearoa, New Zealand, when I was growing up, had around 3.5 to 4 million people, and now has about 5. The Indigenous people, the Māori people, are the tangata whenua, the people of the land. They're about 15% of the population, but very assimilated into white or Pākehā or settler culture. So there's always been conversations about how that plays out. And the Treaty of Waitangi, which was a treaty that promised land sovereignty and ownership of fisheries and waters, signed in 1840, has been a foundation document and has been contested. So, and at the moment, it's live issues right up to today around land, about co-governance. The Anglican Church in Aotearoa, New Zealand, about 20 years ago, became a 3 tikanga church, 3 streams, a Māori stream, Pākehā stream, a Pacifica stream. So there's lots of discussion around race in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So I've always been interested in issues of race and ethnicity. Then living in East Africa, as a white person in East Africa, as a foreigner, that's an interesting experience. You perhaps experience race in a different way as a foreigner and an incomer and an outsider. I think feminism has influenced me hugely, because I think feminism is about justice and equality and wanting rights for women. So I see that very much as a justice issue. Probably the way I've learned most is through friendship with people like Anthony Reddie, particularly a friendship with a colleague, Harvey Kuyani, who writes in this area. He's on our team. He's originally from Malawi. He's on our teaching team at CMS. And we've had lots of conversations, and some difficult conversations where he's had to point out to me where I've been, I guess, not just unconsciously biased, but maybe even consciously biased without being aware of it. Mistakes that I've made. And yeah, they've been some hard conversations, but we have to have those for us to realize, and for me to realize, where I have been blind and racist. we 2 years ago in our teaching at CMS introduced an African diaspora stream, an African diaspora program, which is alongside our pioneer program, and we have been learning together. So we have diaspora students both from Britain, and we also have students from the continent of Africa learning alongside British students, and that has introduced some very rich and challenging conversations, and it really is about learning together and challenging one another's perspectives. So that's something that shaped me in terms of race and learning and pedagogy. And being exposed, I guess, to a variety of voices. Black Lives Matter certainly conscientised us. One particular scholar that James and I like and quote extensively actually in the chapter is Willie James Jennings. So his work, Christian Imagination After Whiteness, very interesting article he wrote about land, which we use and his commentary on Acts, which is used in the chapter. So Harvey says he thinks diversity is the new normal. And so it's really being exposed to a variety of voices, but particularly in terms of friendship, where you can build up that trust to be honest with one another about mistakes that have made, about feeling excluded, about white fragility, about entitlement and privilege and things that we take for granted that are not the experience of people from other races. So I think the short answer to that, what has conscientised me and challenged me the most is friendship. But obviously it's reading. I read, loads of books and listened to podcasts, Christina Cleveland, Afua Hirsch, Renieto Lodge, it's just so much out there that I found fascinating and illuminating and challenging. And then being able to talk about those things with Harvey and Anthony and others has just been, has opened up other worlds. It's been amazing.
Thank you. A bigger question now. What do you think are the biggest challenges to the church and wider society in terms of creating frameworks for social justice?
Well, basically whiteness, privilege and entitlement. You want the short answer, but which I think means that for some of us there's a kind of, I'm going to use the phrase willful blindness. We're just blind to so many issues. I think all I'm going to say now are different ways of saying whiteness, privilege and entitlement. A lack of awareness of context. So every context requires attentiveness and listening and awareness and appreciation, and that takes time. I think a lack of curiosity. I just think so many people in the church are so uncurious. Like, be curious about the world. So I find that so distressing, and this kind of lack of imagination that things could be different, that we could live in a different world, that things can change, that it doesn't have to be like this. So I would love, a wider curiosity and imagination and a dreaming for what could be, and that this could happen. It's up to us. We can make this happen. Obviously things like climate crisis and climate grief, that's another area, but I think that really makes people feel very stressed and worried. I think in the West, which we became much more aware of after living in East Africa, is our extreme individualism. I think that is a real block to how we could imagine another world, and a lack of willingness to collaborate and share and be together. Willie James Jennings talks about a contrast community and living in shared neighbourhoods, and how Jesus attracted people around him that didn't even necessarily want to be together, but we have to learn how to live together and the richness that there is in that. And maybe that just all boils down to, in the end, what has been my biggest challenge and joy is, for example, I talked about my friendship with Harvey. So just a lack of friendship with people who are different from ourselves. And maybe an unwillingness to open ourselves to others, an unwillingness to be hospitable. and then having a kind of proper humility about ourselves. Like, I think, and I don't mind saying this on this video, I am a member of the Church of England. Although obviously I'm not originally English, but I think the Church of England takes itself far too seriously. And I think that is a major problem. We need a proper humility, and we need to listen and learn from other contexts and other perspectives. So in terms of the church, yeah, I think it's taking itself too seriously. It's a sense of privilege and entitlement and being at the centre, which it isn't. It isn't even at the centre, even though it thinks it is, because not that many people care about the Church of England. And getting with the programme, which are issues of justice, which is about feminism and race and diversity and climate. And we just seem to be so far behind in all these things. So I think they're huge challenges. And we are the ones who are called to a relationship with Jesus that means we can be a new community. So let's live that. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, I think it goes a long way to answering that. Thank you. So just to finish, what do you hope people will take away from reading your chapter?
Well, I hope that people will see from reading the chapter about Hadfield, and on the one hand his advocacy for Maori, and on the other hand how he was still, to a greater or lesser extent, enmeshed in empire, the empire of his day, which was the British Empire. So I hope that what we might take away is how we're all enmeshed in our own context, and to a certain extent still in this colonial or post-colonial context, and that we need a variety of voices and inputs to see that. So I guess we hope to sum up our learnings, we reflected on how we are still entangled in the logic of our own day. We think we need a closer reading of scripture, and we were intrigued by the little bit of research we did around Hadfield, which is clearly not his whole life. We were focusing on one particular incident about some land in Taranaki, but we were intrigued when we read some of the primary sources, the letters that Hadfield wrote and the letters and petitions that the Maori wrote. The Maori quoted scripture a lot more than Hadfield, and they had a very interesting take on scripture, and it was clearly very precious to them. Of course, they were introduced to scripture by CMS missionaries, because it was an oral culture, and it was CMS missionaries that transliterated and translated the Bible into Maori. So they had taken the scriptures and made them their own, and were able to interpret scriptures in ways that made sense for them. So we actually saw a closer reading of and attentiveness to scripture, and almost a deeper spirituality and prayer than we did in Hadfield's writings. Not to say Hadfield was not attentive to scripture and not prayerful, but it wasn't expressed in the same way in his writings that it was in the local Maori. I guess another learning is, as I've already mentioned, just to ask ourselves, how are we complicit with unjust structures? And are we enthralled or maybe even captivated by the logic of capitalism? And when we're embedded in it, how do we fight against that and model something different and live out something different? And how can we listen more carefully to diverse voices, to the diversity of voices that are in our world? So I guess those are some of the learnings that we think about, which leads to things like decolonizing, moving away from individualism, focusing on reconciliation and justice, seeing diversity as a gift, challenging and questioning our own postures, and that it's okay to have uncomfortable conversations and to live with a certain level of discomfort, because that is what is required to move forward, I think. So those are some of our learnings.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing with us today, and we look forward to hopefully hearing from James soon.
Yeah, you will.
And eventually reading your chapter. So
Thank
thanks
you,
for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.